We are going to test your cognitive skills on how you're able to completely change framework and also style, I believe, unfortunately, of the speaker. You're such a great, yeah, it was so much fascinating and so much concentrated on what you were saying that now I find it difficult to present my talk. I wanted to hear more. And okay, so. This is a joint paper. For those who know also my co-author, somehow you kind of expect what I'm going to say, and you're going to see basically no pictures and a bit of math. It's a paper on measuring economic insecurity, and in all my research with Walter in the paper we have been writing so far was to try to say that and propose a measure of the well-being of an individual, generally speaking, it's not only of the poor, that it depends on the past, the present, and the future of the individual. So my well-being today, it's not only on what I have today, which is mainly what standard measures look at, but it also depends on how I got there and somehow on what I forecast on happening about the future. And so it's not just a temporal. You have somehow to try to capture the history of the individual and what he believes, something what's with the future of what he expects. And in this paper, this is an attempt to include consideration an individual may have on his future. So we have written some papers on including somehow the persistence in a state of poverty, for example, on persistence, not only looking at income, but also at some other measures of the well-being. This one instead is on include a measure of the anxiety he may feel about the future situation, his future. And we started this project talking about vulnerability to poverty, so we were interested in proposing a measure of vulnerability, but then we realized that probably the fear about the future is something that can affect all of us. It's not only fear for those who are poor, but also myself, who's definitely not someone poor, feel some anxiety about the future. And then we decided to change the wording. It's not anymore vulnerability, but we called it insecurity. So vulnerability to poverty is the probability of being poor, so reflects only this sentiment, its anxiety of a segment of the population who is poor. Economic insecurity instead is something that affects all of us, so is how self-confident we are in some sense about the future. And when we started to write this paper, we did a lot of search, I did a lot of search in the literature on what was this term, what is economic insecurity. And even if it's a word that we keep using and we listen to a lot of people using it, especially since the financial crisis of 2008, so whenever you turn on the TV and you listen to the radio, there are a lot of people who are saying that we feel very much economic insecure, then there is not a very clear definition on what it is. And it's not only a fact that we listen people, ordinary people, to talk about insecurity, but also in the very famous report by the Stiglitz Commission. So the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report by the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. They also use insecurity, economic insecurity, as a key concept of the measure of well-being and social progress. So we have to go beyond the GDP in measuring economic well-being of people. So we don't have to look only at production, but we have to include some other aspects of the quality of life and the environment in measuring the social progress of a society and well-being. So they started to use this term, economic insecurity, there as well. And they say that insecurity, the reason why we should look at insecurity is that insecurity is a source of fears and anxiety that negatively affects the quality of life of all people concerned. And insecurity also implies uncertainty about the future, which decreases quality of life for risk-averse individuals. So this is the reason they claim why we should also look at insecurity together with income, consumption, and wealth, and a lot of other characteristics for measuring the quality of life of an individual. So in spite of this persistence of the sentiment, it appears that a formal definition and a precise suggestion on how to measure insecurity have remained elusive so far. So we all talk about insecurity, we listen to people talking about insecurity, policymakers somehow are recommended to look at insecurity, but there is not a real definition on what economic insecurity is. So we all feel that we somehow know what economic insecurity is. And in this paper, it's an attempt to provide one measure of insecurity and to focus on one aspect of this broad concept of economic insecurity. And there is more to this absence of what economic insecurity is, because we have searched on dictionaries of economic jargon and on encyclopedias where entries of economics are present, and we have found no entry on economic insecurity. And also there are a few papers that have dealt with defining and measuring economic insecurity. So let's try to see what people mean when they talk about economic insecurity. So browsing the web, these are some of the definitions we found. So the United Nations, for example, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, they say it's not easy to give a precise meaning to the term economic insecurity, partly because it often draws on comparisons with past experiences and practices, and also because security has a large subjective or psychological component linked to feelings of anxiety and safety. Still, in general terms, economic insecurity arises from the exposure to adverse events and from the inability to cope with and recover from the costly consequences of these events. So it's a fear. It arises from the fear of adverse event that can hit you in the future, and it depends also on your past, on how well you behaved in the past in facing these adverse events that hit you. According to Lars Osberg, a definition of economic insecurity, which reflects the common usage meaning of the term insecure, might be the anxiety produced by the lack of economic safety, that is, by an inability to obtain protection against subjectively significant potential economic losses. So this is more objective definition of insecurity, and it is how a subject can react when there are missing some protection against the basic risk of life you can face. And Jacob suggests that economic insecurity is perhaps best understood as the intersection between perceived and actual downside risk. And this is about Wikipedia. Economic insecurity or financial insecurity is the condition on having stable income or other resources to support a standard of living now and in the foreseeable future. So looking at all these definitions around, we try to come up with a definition. So for the Stiglitz Commission, economic insecurity may be defined as uncertainty about the material condition that may prevail in the future. And insecurity may generate stress and anxiety. So what we thought of what are the common threads of what we found around and what was our belief of a way to define economic insecurity is the anxiety which arises from the anticipation of adverse events and from the fear of difficulties to recover from them. So it has to do with the future. It generates anxiety to you, and it is related to the fear you have on how well you can behave in the future when you are hit by an economic shock, by a negative event in your life. So it's not only about the fear of becoming poor, which is trying to capture by a measure of vulnerability to poverty, the probability of being poor, but this is something that can hit all of us, even if you are rich. And it's the anxiety that this sentiment generates in you, and it depends also on the confidence you have on how well you can react. So it's what you have today and your self-confidence. In the literature, there are 3 indices, to the best of our knowledge, that try to measure economic insecurity. The first is an index by Osberg and Sharp, so I will briefly present these 3 indices, and then I will, the first 2 indices, and then I will introduce ours. The second is the Economic Security Index, and then the third is our index. So I will briefly go through the first 2 to show you the differences in the approach we have to measuring economic insecurity. So the first index is an index by Osberg and Sharp, and if you remember a bit the definition Lars Osberg gave before about economic insecurity and the fact that it has to do with objective risks an individual can face in his life, then you can see that from that definition of insecurity, this is what they try to capture in this measure, is he looks at the major risks, so what are the traditional risks you get told by a professor in the public economics class. So the big risk we face is the case of unemployment, sickness, widowhood, and old age. So their index of economic insecurity is not at an individual level, is at an aggregate level, and they measure for each society, they compare society, what is the protection that is offered by the welfare state from, in the case of unemployment, sickness, widowhood, and old age, that are the classical risks you can face. Predictable risk somehow. So insecurity for Osberg and Sharp is seen as a failure of the welfare state. It cannot really protect us in the case of these risks. And the index they propose is a weighted sum of the scaled values of the 4 components: security from unemployment that is offered, illness that is offered to individual, widowhood, they say in our society is not only when you become a widow, but also when the family splits. So it's more general than losing the partner, but it's also protection when you become a single parent, and then a poverty that you can face in old age. So they compute the protection that is offered to citizens of different countries, and this is the index of economic insecurity they propose. So it's the population that is available in each country that is not protected by these 4 risks. The Economic Security Index instead is financed by, the project is financed by the Rockefeller Foundation, and is an index proposed by Hacker at Yale and a group of experts. And the Rockefeller Foundation, the Economic Security Index, so the opposite, is part of a wider project of the foundation, started in 2008, and it's part of this campaign for American workers with the objective to improve economic security among American workers and their families. So the Economic Security Index was introduced in 2010, and it deals only with the American society, and it looks at the security that is offered to the society, and it's available for some years from today and for the past. Now, they say that this index of economic security has to capture three major risks of economic well-being that US citizens can face. And the first is the fear of a major income loss. Then the second, for the way the American society is, the welfare state works in the United States, it's the fear of not having a health insurance, so out-of-pocket medical expenses. And then it also depends on the fact that you miss liquid financial wealth to deal with the two risks that you can face. So in the Economic Security Index for the US that is available, they compute the percentage of the population who report, who is not able to protect themselves in the sense of paying for their health, and who experience a major economic loss in their past, and that not have liquid financial assets to face the major economic loss or out-of-pocket medical expenses. So it is equal to the share of US citizens who experience the major economic loss. They believe it's equal to 25% of the decline in their income that is adjusted by inflation and also adjusted by out-of-pocket medical expenses they had to face, and who do not have enough liquid financial asset to be able to cover their family, to protect their family against this loss. So they look at the percentage of the population who had to face this big loss, according to them 25%, either because they became unemployed or very different reason, the family split, or someone died in their family, and or someone got sick, because this income is also adjusted by out-of-pocket medical expenses, and who are also financially poor in the sense that they lack some financial liquid resources to protect themselves in case they will somehow have to face such a loss also in the future. So they share some similarities, these two indices. They are both measure of objective issues, such as the first is the Osberg and Sharp is risks, and the second is losses. And the losses that are considered in the Economic Security Index are related to the risk that you face that are measured in the first index, because you can have a big loss in your income if you become unemployed, the case of widowhood, if you reach old age. So the losses that can produce the drop in income, which is considered in the second index, are the risk, the major risk an individual can face, that are at the basis of the first index. Now, our measure is very different, and we want really to capture a subjective fear an individual may feel when he faces his future. So it's not we're not trying to capture objective risks here, but we try to put ourselves in the shoes of an individual, and we want to try to measure his fear about the future. So we want to capture the anxiety each of us has in looking at our financial future. So we want to capture the anxiety produced by the anticipation. So we are anxious because we are anticipating something, and what we are anticipating, what makes us anxious, is the anticipation of a negative event, so of a negative financial loss. Also, so we face, to be anxious, not only you have to anticipate a loss, but you also have to fear that you're not able to make it. And then we think that in measuring this anxiety, somehow you have to capture, it depends on your history, on what you have today, and you want to anticipate something that will happen in the future. So past, present, and future are involved. Now, we are insecure about a future event because we know where we are today, and the past cannot shape cannot produce anxiety to us. And the resources we have today are very important because the wealthier we are, the more secure we feel in how well we can handle a financial loss we are hit, a financial loss we get in our future. And the wealthier we are, it's the wealth we have today, of course, is a measure of, it's a summary statistics, is a measure of our past. But we want also to capture the self-confidence an individual have. So the wealth of today is not enough to capture how self-confident you are in dealing with the future. And past experiences, we believe, are very important in shaping the self-confidence of an individual. And we have a memory of how well or bad we did in the past. So for us, insecurity, which is this anxiety produced by a fear for the future and by the anticipation of the inability to cope with a loss you may get in the future, depends not only on what you have today, but on how self-confident you are. And the self-confidence you get, it comes from your past experience, from how well or how bad you did in the past in facing a loss, or how well in case you got a gain in your wealth. And evidence from psychology and economics support the view that you remember your past and that your past shapes your confidence on the future. So this one is a very famous sentence decision theorists cite. And they say all reasoning is from night. All reasoning rests on the principle of analogy. We know the absent from the present, the future from the now. By assuming that connection or association among phenomena which have been valid will be so, we judge the future by our past. So we assume that this sentiment of insecurity depends on, as I said, on what you have today, and which is what you can count on, and then on this self-confidence that has been shaped by your history and what happened to you in the past. And of course, this is one definition of economic insecurity, one aspect of this term, and I believe that there is still a lot to be done in trying to come up with measuring economic insecurity. For example, one of the strongest absence, it's what the insecurity you get, what we do not deal with in this paper, is the insecurity you get from what's happening by people around you, which is definitely important. So from what you see around you, there is no interdependency in this measure of economic insecurity, but definitely there is. So you may anticipate, for example, that you may lose your job or you may incur in a loss if you see people that are similar to you losing a job. Or if you listen to the TV, which is what's been happening recently in all our countries, and they tell us, there is no growth, we are in a recession, so you fear that this, even if you're not been hit personally by the phenomenon of this recession, you may anticipate that something's going to happen to you as well. So this part of interdependency for the moment is completely missing. So wealth, what you can count on is not only what we believe as wealth, what economists define as wealth, but is really more similar to what Amartya Sen defined as entitlements. So everything you can claim on, you can claim from what you can claim from the government, so what's offered, the welfare state of the society you live in, what you can get from families, what you can get from friends. So today is the wealth we have in mind is this variable that is not only what you have, but also what you can get in case you're in urge of finding something, some money, and the protection you can get from the government. And the measure we propose is characterized in this paper. So we propose two basic properties we think that a measure of economic insecurity should possess. And then we move to a more specific class of measures of economic insecurity by proposing an additional axiom. And the measure that you will see is similar to the Gini coefficient in the sense that it's the wealth of today. And remember that by wealth we mean the entitlement, so it's what you have today. It's a negative. The more you have, the less insecure you are. And then, which is what you can really count on. And then there is this confidence bit that is taken by your history. And we look at the drops and gain of these variables. So it's a weighted sum of losses and gains. And you will see that we get this coefficient to losses and gains. And we also believe that you remember your past, but the closer the event, the higher your memories. So the first property that we'll impose is that these weights that you attach to losses and gains, they have to be increasing in the sense that the closer to today, the higher the weight you give to the event. So you have memory of your past, but the memory are more vivid if the event is closer to now. And the second class, the more specific class of measure, is the fact that probably you give more importance to a drop than to a gain of the similar magnitude. So the last class of measures we propose is a measure where the weights are not only increasing, so today you remember more, but also for the same magnitude of the change, you give more importance to a loss than to a gain. Okay, so we apply, as I said, two series of coefficients, one to losses and one to gains. And then we want the coefficient to be higher the closer the event is to today. And then we have this subclass of measures where, as I said, we give more importance to a loss than to a gain of the same magnitude. And we characterize this measure with a set, we believe, of plausible and intuitive axioms. So there are two axioms that are at the basis of this measure, and then there are some general axioms that are used in social index numbers. So a bit of notation. T is time, and 0 is today, -1 is yesterday, -2 is the year before. And V is our measure of economic insecurity. We are looking at wealth streams. Again, remember that wealth is this comprehensive variable. This is the wealth stream of a generic individual. Wealth can be negative because there are periods in which you have a negative wealth, you borrow. And this is an individual that today has a wealth level of 2. And this is his history. So yesterday he had 0, the year before -2. Then he had 3, and then he started from 1. So these are the basic objects we work with. And we want to propose a measure of individual insecurity. This is something else we do not do. We do not propose a measure of the society insecurity. This is at the individual level for the moment. And the basic object we work with are these wealth streams of individual. This is a general one. So the two properties are, we believe that now we are trying to shape your self-confidence. So if you have an increase, you feel more confident. If you had a loss in the past, you feel more not confident because you were hit by something. And then the other thing is that the closer to today this shift happens, these changes happened, the more vivid your memories. So you are confident about the future depending on what has happened to you in the past. And whenever you were hit by a loss, you are more not confident. And whenever you made it, you were hit by a gain, your self-confidence increases. So an easy way to remember what I'm saying, imagine that, think of finding a partner. So, of course, how you what you have today is important. The partner you have today is very important. And then, if you may have or not fear of losing the partner, and self-confidence, depending on what happened to you in the past. If you were, if your girlfriend or your partner dropped you, dumped you, that's the word, you're not confident. And then if you were able to find many partners, your self-confidence increases on your measure of your well-being today, okay? So it's who you're with today, and then this, what your history in finding a partner happened. Okay, so the first property is this property of the changes. A decrease, this axiom that we call difference monotonicity is that there is a decrease in insecurity if we include a gain. There is an increase in insecurity if we include a loss, and insecurity stays the same if you haven't changed partner. So this is it. If we add a period, and this period includes a gain, then the wealth stream with 4 periods compared to the wealth stream with 5 periods when there is a gain, the one with 5, since you matched, you found someone, it's associated to less insecurity than the second wealth stream when there wasn't the gain. The second axiom is this proximity property. And it just says that it's a property that allows us to have that the closer the change, the more vivid your memory. So the closer to the present the gain or the losses, the more importance this effect has. And graphically, it's the following. If we compare the wealth stream with the solid line with the wealth stream with the dotted line, and you see that the drop happened in the solid line closer to today than in the dropped line, then insecurity of the associated with the solid wealth stream is higher than insecurity associated with the other one when the loss happened more in the past. So these are our two main properties, the basic one, the fundamental axioms. And then to characterize this measure, we use just standard axioms such as homogeneity, translatability, and then temporal aggregation, which is what allows us to get the sum. And this is just that insecurity, if you add a period, is just a function of insecurity up to that period, up to yesterday, and then what happened on the change of today. So this is our measure, is insecurity of an individual at time t, depends negatively on the wealth he has at time t. The more wealth you are, the less insecure you feel. And this is the history, the self-confidence. We look at the weighted sum of the gains and the losses in this variable. And the only constraint we have is on these weights, the alpha and the beta. And we want them to be just higher the closer the event is to today. So this is the simple measure we characterize with the properties that I shown you before. The two fundamental properties we believe insecurity should have, plus standard properties that are used in characterizing indices. The last is when we go towards a more specific measure, a more specific class of indices, and this is where we impose that a loss is more important than a gain in shaping your self-confidence of the same magnitude. So we impose this weak loss property, which just says that a loss of the same magnitude has more effect on your insecurity than a gain. And we are able to characterize this other class of measure, which is as before, but now there is a relationship between the weights on the same change if the weight on a loss of a magnitude has to be greater than the weight you have when there is a gain of the same magnitude. So I'm done. This is a way to try to propose a measure of economic insecurity, which is something we all use. As I said, is a partial. We focus just on one aspect. It's individual, so we do not propose a way to aggregate insecurity at the society level. And definitely it also depends on insecurity of people around you. So that part of interdependence is missing. And we think that we have provided a step in answering to the, for example, to the recommendation we got again in the Stiglitz report. They say that quality of life also depends on people's objective conditions and opportunities, as we know, and steps should be taken to improve measures of people's health. This is from the Stiglitz report: education, personal activity, political voice, social connection, environmental condition, and insecurity. So this is an effort to propose a measure of individual insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Conchita. And we will now move on to the questions and answer session. And basically the way in which I would propose that we go ahead is that we take like 3 questions and then in rounds, and then we give the presenters the possibility for commenting, and then we'll round off before the coffee break. So can I see, please, indications of questions? Okay, that's a lot already. I will start then in the back. Right, there are 2 hands, one here and one here. Yeah. Okay, I can see the gentleman said ladies first.
I was drawing off of Conchita's definition of insecurity.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Do you mind presenting yourself and just stating your name and institution? And then stand up, because it's then easier to kind of...
Sure. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. My name is Nava Ashraf. I'm from Harvard Business School. I was thinking about Conchita's definition of insecurity as anxiety, and also about the relationship with stuff that might have happened to you in the past, that you may still feel this anxiety now. And so, Sendel, I wanted to ask you, as you think about cognitive resources, it's not just about the cognitive resources at the moment. It may be that, in general, you may be taxed, but also these particular things about financial planning may induce a level of emotional anxiety that can be even more difficult to make decisions in the moment. So this would involve a more psychological dimension that brings in emotions, but I'm wondering what you think about that given what we've heard from Conchita.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm Greg Fischer from the London School of Economics, and I think this actually follows a little bit on Nava's question. It was actually something that, while Sendel was talking, Javi and I were chatting about as well. So Sendel, in the experiment that you and Dean ran with the vegetable vendors, I know that one thing you did was actually pay down the debt of many of the vendors who had got themselves in this position where they were spending 50% of their daily income to pay down the debt. And I'm wondering why you think they actually ran themselves back into debt, because it would seem like in that optimization between the alpha and the beta, once you pay down their debt, they would now actually have the cognitive resources to hopefully make better decisions going forward. And it seemed like there was some persistence in this failure to make those decisions. It'd be nice to understand what creates that persistence, if you believe it's there, and whether or not it relates to that sort of, the persistence of emotions that Nava brought up as well.
Yeah.
Okay, Ravi?
Ravi Nava, Cornell University. I had an observation on Sendel's last slide, the policy implications, because I think what he says really links very intricately to a literature on targeting transfers, targeting anti-poverty programs. So we have the literature on indicator targeting, where basically the poor don't have to do anything. You identify, according to some correlates, who the poor are. So there's no tax on them at all. The tax is all on the implementer. And there's a big literature on the costs of that and the administrative costs, et cetera, et cetera. So then you say, well, because of the cost of that, we go to self-targeting, where we design a structure and we let anybody turn up, but only the poor will turn up given the incentive structures that you've. And there, the whole idea is that the opportunity cost for the rich should be, so to speak, higher than so long queues, filling out long forms, et cetera, is one way in which you can begin to target. And I think what's interesting, the first point of interest is that the same mechanisms which may economize, which may, so to speak, go in the right direction in one sense, may go in the other direction in terms of your psychic, in terms of the physical world versus the psychic world. I think that's very interesting, I think. The second point is that in the design of these things, there's always discretion that the implementers have. And this is a very big issue in terms of, you can actually impose costs on the participants, and there's a discretion that the implementer has. You can be rude to the person, you can whatever, etc. And in the Indian Employment Guarantee Act, for example, the Act actually specifies how far away from the village the public works scheme should be. No further than 5 kilometers. Why? Because you can have an employment guarantee scheme, but you can hold the public works program at the top of a mountain, okay, and say, well, nobody came, it was a guarantee, but nobody came, etc. And it seems to me that in this psychic dimension, the implementer has much greater scope for actually using discretion to prevent people from participating by designing the scheme in such a way that is not monitorable by a central authority. And that's the set of issues that arise. So I think.
Okay. Reactions, comments? Conchita first, and Sendel?
Yeah, I think that probably we should write a paper together, the two of us, because it's definitely, I agree that the first two questions are related, and it really depends on your history, the way you behave. So there is, your emotions are still there. And there is some, are still there today, so there is some literature in economics that has shown, for example, that investors' behavior depends very much on what they have seen in the past. For example, there is a paper by Manmander and Nagel who show that if you were hit by, if you grew up in the period of recession, and then your memories about that influence your behavior on the way you invest today. And there is also some other literature by, for example, Fogli and Olivetti, and they try to explain how come that women participation in the labor market increased now. And they have shown that if you are grown up in a family when your mother works, then it's more likely that, that you will work and that your partner is going, your female partner is going to work. So definitely I believe that also in the behavior of the poor, I don't know, this is what I expect. There is some memory on what they used to be, so it's also a matter of knowledge. So when you pay off their debt, they still behave as they were behaving before.
Yeah, on top of the memory issue, I think there's, let me just take a big step back for a second and talk a little bit about, I've been trying to use the phrase psychic resources, but that's obviously a catch-all for an enormous number of things. And so the question arises, do we think about anxiety differently in some way than other emotions or self-control or cognition? And I guess I have a two-part answer to that. One, I've been struck at how there is a congruence of these concepts across things. So for example, the literature on sort of anxiety and heightened activation implies, in one sense, very similar things to the literature on depletion or on the impacts of cognitive load. They all imply a narrowing effect. So anxiety has quite a narrowing effect on everything from visual perception to cognition to a focus on the now. And if I were to conjecture, I'd conjecture that there's probably a very primitive system that all of this latches onto, a system that goes back to the generalized stress response, in which both from an emotional point of view but also from a cognition point of view there is a narrowing effect. And so the movement away from thinking about the future to thinking about the now is a fairly primitive thing. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's a sense in which I would actually say it may not be as productive. It's useful, but as a first pass, putting all of these into one bin is not a stupid idea. I didn't start there, but I ended up there. The second pass, though, which I think suggests there is something very distinct about anxiety, very distinct and interestingly distinct, has to do with the selective search for information. One way in which anxiety differs from all of these other emotions, all of these other psychic capital, is that anxiety is heightened by exposure to certain types of information. If you're worried that that mole on your back is a cancerous mole, one thing you can do to reduce anxiety is to not go to the doctor, is to not think about the doctor, is to not listen to anything about cancer at all. That's remarkably perverse, because the thing that you can do to help with your anxiety is the thing that locally you try to avoid. And I think in the last financial crisis, we actually saw some quite striking evidence of this behavior, and we have some data on this. So for example, we ran an experiment where we took, we sent letters to people, and the letters had, the outside covers were of two different types. One was from a marketing agency, and one was from your lender. So we actually got work with lenders. So it came from your lender. And we had two groups of people who were delinquent on their debt and people who were not delinquent on their debt. And inside was actually not a letter, but it was a gift card simply saying, thanks for being a customer, here's 20 bucks, you know, use it as you see fit. So all we were interested in is, we were just interested in, did people even open this mail? And what was fascinating was, of course, for non-delinquent people, you open something from your servicer at a much higher rate than that from delinquent people. But you can imagine those who are delinquent and feeling behind and feeling anxious, they really didn't even open the letter from their servicer. And that's the sense in which selective information exposure, I think, has huge consequences, because it's a behavior that's caused by anxiety. And in the foreclosure case, we found, for example, in Philadelphia, they did this. They went into homes that were foreclosed, and the single thing they found in all of these homes, anyone have guesses? This was a surprise. Every home had this. Bags of unopened mail from the servicer, which was interesting because some of those mails said, we want to work with you to redo your mortgage so that you can stay in the house. And yet, of course, so there's this effect of anxiety, which I think is important. So there are a few behavioral differences. So I think I'd say I've been amazed at how much common elements there are, such as shortening behind, but I do think there are these distinct elements, and I think understanding them would be helpful. Let me just say two quick responses. Ravi, I agree with everything you said. I would say the evidence supports your self-targeting failing view. We've done a little bit of work on self-targeting of programs in the US and trying to understand who is the marginal person. And in a way, for certain types of hassle costs, we're actually finding that the marginal person is poorer, not richer. In other words, you put up a barrier, you're actually keeping out the poor, not keeping out the rich. And I think, Greg, the answer on the vendors thing, and maybe Dean disagrees with me on this, I actually think the answer is quite supportive of what I put up. And let me explain what I mean. In a world where the vendors are simply myopic, you expect the vendors to fall back, but you expect them to fall back right then and there. In a world where the income boost makes them more forward-looking, you expect them to stay up for some time. They'll fall back over time to the extent that there are shocks or the money wasn't enough to get their beta high enough. They'll fall back whenever they hit a bump down. But there's a real asymmetry in these models which has to do with, and this I think is very importantly related to economic insecurity, because when people have a bump down, they're in a condition of poverty. Take the same income level, add a little bit of volatility, it'll drive people down. So the vendor, and so that's a deep sense in which variance has a big effect in these models, a huge effect, because you make worse decisions in the downstate that aren't compensated for by better decisions in the upstate. So that's how I would kind of understand what the vendor, even if the income was enough, a little bit of variance would shake everything back down.
Okay, thank you. There was somebody in the middle, yeah. Pete first, and then here, and then here.
Peter Serneels from University of East Anglia. Thanks very much for your talk, and this is a question for Sendel. So you emphasize very much that, okay, in poverty one is poor at planning, and you emphasize very much that this is due to a lack of psychic resources. There would be another view out there, which is that planning has to do very much with being able to have quite accurate reference points in the future, which is a challenge to obtain. And these reference points are socially embedded. So I wonder, could you illuminate us a little bit what your view is on the kind of social environment that plays a role in your story?
And then here in the middle.
Thank you. Sando Kojokaro, University of Maryland. I have a question for Sendel, and particularly relates to sort of poverty as it relates to time constraints and complexity. I remember coming to the US many years ago for graduate school as from the Soviet Union. Trivial tasks like grocery shopping and buying milk were incredibly mentally taxing, just because, you know, for whatever reason there are 20 types of milk, and given that I was a poor graduate student, I actually had to think about it. And so the question is, you know, given the sort of the findings that you present, would you say that the actual process of economic development can actually, and sort of the increasing complexity of life, can create a poverty trap of its own, where, you know, people who persist in poverty, find themselves in poverty as the sort of the country develops and life becomes more complex, will actually, you know, find it harder and harder to escape it, just because, you know, their mental resources have been taxed more and more. Thank you.
Okay, Jukka.
Yes, I'm Jukka Virttilä from University of Tampere here in Finland. I have a question first to Sendhil regarding the role of education. I think we have some evidence from rich countries that even if the income level is the same, people at different education levels might have different degrees of self-control and myopia. So do you think education might be a mitigating factor, improving education to address some of these issues in your in your talk? And the question on Conchita is that it would be really interesting to see applications of these indices to countries at different income levels. That on the other hand, objectively speaking, many of the people in poor countries would be economically insecure. But it's not so clear whether that also holds for subjective measures, if people can adapt to the insecurity. So that would be interesting to see applications.
Okay, thank you. Conchita, you want to go first?
It's a great suggestion. The problem we're trying to apply this measure, but we have problems in finding a data set that allows us to have, because we need panel data, and then we need to come up with this measure of wealth. And also for developed countries, it's hard to find a panel data that has at least information on wealth. So we were thinking of looking at the wealth today, and then the changes, for example, savings. So now we are looking for another panel data set that has information on wealth today, and then at least something on savings that we can look at. So it's a great idea, and we are working on it. Thanks.
So I'll work backwards. Actually, you know what? Let me just answer the first two questions. I think they're related, and I think they're related by this fact that I waved my hands about something, and what I waved my hands about is kind of, I said a lot of things are keyed on UPrime. High marginal utility today draws attention, draws cognitive resources. Well, what is UPrime? I mean, where does it come from? After all, I tried to argue to you that someone in the U.S. getting their EIC payment is a big income shock. That person's making, arguably 100 times what the farmer in the sugarcane study was making. There has to be a deep sense in which UPrime is somehow socially constructed. And so I would think the easiest way to understand the impact of the social environment has to be on that. And here's one way to understand that. If you were a farmer in India 20 years ago, and this is related to the development question as well. If you're a farmer in India 20 years ago and you were the middle of the pack land-owning sugarcane farmer in a South Indian village, a TV was a luxury. It wasn't a basic thing that you felt you needed to have. Roll things forward, a TV through the process of development becomes more and more a sense of a thing that you must have, partly through social norms. Everyone else has it. It'll look weird if you don't. So there's a sense in which the needs and the U-primes that are being created must be construed socially. It's impossible for us to understand, I think, a model based on U-prime without having those elements in it. And it's impossible for us to understand the process of development through a world like this without understanding those type of elements. And in some sense, I think that's the complexity of choice. It doesn't even need to be a complexity of the type of things that are offered to us. Simply having Michael Jordan sneakers offered to you now at $300, which lots of people now have, forces a difficult trade-off for the parent. Do I buy this for my kid or not? And the kid really wants it. The last thing I'll just say quickly on education. I don't know that I understand what education is. And I mean that in the deepest sense. And I'm not sure we understand what it is at all. And I have a feeling if you ask me what the big change in development will be in the next 30 years, it'll be, and maybe this is biased, it'll be to go back and say human capital is just too big a black box. Like it's a useful thing to maybe throw into a growth regression, but what is it? Is it math skills? Is it reading skills? Is that what we mean when we say education, that we're teaching people? Is it skills about how to plant stuff? Are we teaching people effectively are cognitive skills being developed in the process of education? Is self-control being developed? What is this capital stock in which we talk about human capital? So in a way, it's hard for me to think of education producing it. My guess is there are very different types of education that produce it differently or worse or less. And it's just, we've black boxed the thing so much, it's very hard for me to understand what's in that black box. And it'd be hard for me to say education as a whole promotes self-control. I can easily imagine certain types of education doing a very good job at that and certain types of education not. We don't know. And I think that's one of the things that we'll need to start getting into the black box of, is kind of human development in this psychic sense. Clearly, there are skills that are developed. I'll tell one little story and then I'll stop it. I used to think, like many people, that when you went and looked at these, schools where the kids just kind of sit there and the teacher is just having them do some stupid rote exercise, and it's the same stupid rote exercise day after day because it's just easy for the teacher to not think it and they're just mailing it in. I used to think those were useful schools, like many people. I mean, you do those kids and you do tests on math, they haven't learned anything. But in a funny way, we did a little study in Orissa that changed my mind a little bit about this, which is we did these self-control tasks with these 5-year-old kids, where basically they're given a cookie and they have a choice between that cookie, and if they manage to not eat that cookie for 15, 20 minutes, they get a second cookie. And a striking thing we found, the schools in these areas are terrible, but a striking thing we found was that the only thing that predicted waiting time for that cookie, their ability to wait, was whether they were in those crappy schools. Even parent income didn't matter. And why? Because after all, maybe what the kid was doing was learning nothing, but the act of sitting there quietly is just the practice of this muscle of self-control. That's just a little story. I mean, we can take it, but I think getting into that black box of education will be pretty transformative once we kind of understand it.
Okay, indications, questions? Over here, yep.
I'm Dan Benjamin, Cornell University. I'm thinking about Sendel's talk, and I really, I love the framework, and I find this idea that when poor people are busy solving the packing problem, that makes it hard to resist little temptations. I find that really compelling. What I'm having trouble thinking through is if poor people are good at solving the intratemporal budget constraint because they're thinking really hard about how they're going to make ends meet and their marginal utility is high, why should we think that would extend to the intertemporal budget constraint as well, where they'd be thinking, well, in terms of planning about saving, maybe opening illiquid savings accounts. Granted, some of the kind of saving is thwarted by giving into temptations, But there are other kinds of saving that you can, if you're thinking carefully about it, you can decide to, have a house and put a lot of your wealth into home equity, or open some other kind of a liquid savings account.
Okay, Marcus.
Marcus Jänti, Stockholm University. I have a question for both Sendel and Conchita. I'll start with Conchita. It seems to me that, well, actually I have two questions. The first property you cited of when you have 4 periods backwards, and a comparison when you go 5 periods backwards and you add an income increase, then there's a change in security. This was the first. Now, I think that conflates two different issues. One is how many periods back should you be going when you kind of recall the extent of insecurity and what kind of changes occurred there. It's a little akin to kind of these population invariance properties of inequality measures, and it seems to me that those are two distinct things, and you should kind of keep the number of time periods the same and vary the change that occurred at a fixed time period. That would make more sense to me. And the other is, which the start of your talk kind of led me to think that you'd actually incorporate something about beliefs about the future into your measure of insecurity. Take the financial crisis, for instance. One of the things that changed was that with a huge decrease in liquidity, the chances of refinancing through home equity dramatically declined in many places, especially in the US, which is a huge increase in insecurity for the people who previously, if they were hit by adverse shock, they just kind of take out a loan against their home equity, and they'd be, and this would seem to me that since you're purely looking backwards in a deterministic fashion without having any subjective probability distribution about future events, would miss a crucial part of what insecurity is. And it would be interesting to see if you could kind of develop this in a forward-looking way in addition. So if you have thoughts on that, I'd be interested in hearing them, or counter-arguments. To Sendhill, it seems to me that it would be interesting to see if these ideas you have would be helpful in understanding things that have happened when transfer programs for the poor have been changed in ways which you might expect would change the capacity of the poor to plan. Take, for instance, in the UK, there was a change in how child benefits were allocated. It used to be through the tax system, and then it was changed to be a flat rate benefit. There was also there was another change associated with this, was that it used to come through a reduction in taxes of the husband, but was now given to the wife, and it's been used to test theories of household bargaining. But it does seem to me that this would also have implications. So essentially, you'd expect that this would affect the planning aspect of the poor after. And there are many changes of this sort, which not all of which would count as natural experiments, but some would. And it would be interesting to see if, in some sense, your view of these things would predict big improvements in planning abilities, if what you say is also true.
Down here.
I'm Xiaobo Zhang from International Food Policy Research Institute, UPrime. I really like Sandel's the lecture. You talk about the psychological origins of poverty trap. But it seems that the conclusion is too pessimistic. If you go to the real world, actually you see sometimes the positive impact of poverty hardship. So I have been following some villages in a very poor province in China. I go to the field, I observe a lot of children in the poor families actually behave much better than children in the cities with so-called small emperors, the one-child families. The children are spoiled because they have so many resources. They don't work hard. They don't control their time well. But in these poor villages, you go to their household, you see small children like 10 years old, collect firewoods and clean the table for you. When you go there, they bring chairs, they behave so well, they're so motivated, they want to change their fate. So if you go to the coast area, you talk to entrepreneurs, you ask them a background. Most of them are from poor families. 20 years ago, they are extremely poor farmers, but now they become entrepreneurs. For most rural entrepreneurs, they are coming from humble background because they are motivated to change their fate. I think maybe we can use some behavioral economics to find some positive examples, to see how we can use the hardship as kind of mechanism to think of ways to help them change their fate. So I think everything have two sides, more like the coins have two sides. Sometimes have positive impact, sometimes have negative impact. How to make use of the hardship to help people to change their destiny. Thank you.
So answering to Marcus, so the second question, it's included in the measure because the wealth we think of is this everything you can count on. So I mentioned families, friends, and you're proposing that it's also how much I can borrow. So if it decreases, it increases. And the other part is if we have to look at an average or at an average numbers of changes or at the absolute numbers, it's very similar. I was thinking to if you have to evaluate your colleague based on the absolute numbers of publication or the average number he published in the year, and probably we should include both in there. So also what has happened to you in a given fixed number of periods that we don't look at. Thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, let me pick up on your question as well. If you ask low-income individuals in the U.S., at least, going back to anxiety, what are the things that make them anxious? One of the things that's in the top 3 for lots of people is actually childcare, finding childcare and arranging that is a big source of cognitive load. So that would be an example where I completely agree with you that a program that gave reliable childcare shouldn't just be viewed as a subsidy transfer program. So I'll say it in its most extreme way, it's an IQ building program. I mean, we are freeing up cognitive capacity that would have gone to managing and worrying and fretting about this issue. So I tend to agree that there are these features of these programs in this case that could have quite big cognitive effects. And when you look at the micro data, it does look like when childcare concerns loom large, people do worse on everything else. Let me say on the last question, when I lived in Chennai a couple of years ago, I had this funny experience where I would get up really early every morning and walk to the gym. And when I walked to the gym in the morning, I always passed this construction site where, ironically, there were some very poor guys carrying these very heavy loads. Now, I would go to my air-conditioned gym and I would lift weights. So we were doing, in some sense, similar things. Now, here's a question. Who's going to be stronger, me or this person? Getting rid of nutrition and some of those effects, I would argue the poor construction worker is going to be stronger, which is related to your point. They're using this muscle. Who's going to have a worse back at 50? Me or this poor construction worker? This poor construction worker. And I'm trying to illustrate a very basic point, which is I completely agree with you. If I were to assign it, and that's why I was very careful to always say they had the same basic cognitive capacity, if I were to sign it, I'd probably even sign it in the other direction. That the data, what little data we have seems to suggest that using these type of resources builds them up, and so that in fact the poor probably have more of those resources. But like the guy lifting these weights, he was stronger, but he was lifting a heavier weight. So in some sense, I think that's the tension of it, is that yes, you're building up these resources, that's the plus side. But the downside is, in certain environments, they need even more than they're able to build up. Does that make sense? Unless the elasticity is greater than 1, so that your stories are compelling because you took somebody who built up resources, but then put them in a level playing field with someone who hadn't, and now that person will shine. Kind of like marathon runners growing up in low altitude environments if they run in high altitude environments if they run in low altitude. So let me just close on the last one, Dan. I don't know why you always have to harass me, Dan. No, I'm totally agreeing with you. One of the issues I spent the longest time on is in understanding this. And that's why I was trying to illustrate at the end why I'm so dissatisfied with a model where you choose what to attend to. When we write this as a micro model, I think the easiest way to think of all of this is that attention is captured by needs. And a way to understand sort of hyperbolic discounting models is similar, is that like a donut is very salient and captures your mind in that moment. Now, the other assumption you need is, and I think it's totally reasonable, is that distant needs, things in the future, don't have the same salience and capture. And then you get everything, basically. Because what happens is that the poor have a lot of immediate needs that capture their attention, that obscure their ability to look into the future. The well-off can satisfy all the needs that would have captured attention, which give them the ability to look more into the future. And so that's obscured in a model where you have the ability and free to choose, but I actually think that's, when you're so caught up in the pressing moment, it is very hard to look past the things that are catching your attention right now. And so I think you're completely right. There is a tension if you use it as a model where you can just choose, because UPrime is high, but so is VPrime, so why shouldn't I put more there? But you really need a more micro model like this to get these effects. So.
Okay, time is up. I have to admit that I don't sort of feel the same level of anxiety every day, and my level of anxiety can even change during the day. I guess the same thing goes a little bit for my feeling of insecurity. But I have to say that right now I'm feeling great. I'm not at all... there's no anxiety inside me. Why? We've gotten off to a great start with 2 fantastic presentations, some really interesting discussion, and I know that some good coffee and tea is waiting. And I'm also knowing that the 3 parallel sessions will be taking off on time. Thank you very much to our presenters. Thank you.